active contemplation, subtle resonances of music heard and inward shivering in our soul, capacity of abandon within focused concentration so that the music doesn't come out choked by our perhaps reductive understanding of it, but in its flow, its air, its life, independently of the ones playing it. Cultural context helps to understand how to organize stylistic facts of a performance. Then comes craftsmanship, technique, then comes analytical organization of formal development of the thought process of the storytelling. But all these things melt when the charisma of a performer embodies just every time differently, because acoustics, instruments, attention span, time of day, and some pieces of the French Impressionism appear differently every time you play them. They surprise you. They reveal themselves differently to you, to the point to which you hear combinations of resonances like tastes or moods or atmospheres or any kind of being rather than actively making. Surprises you, and you can almost as a performer be puzzled by hearing a combination of resonances that comes up somehow on the moment of playing, and you hear things you've never heard when you practiced it. For good or bad reasons, we try to be reliable, organized, so that every time we play, we can be, as the Germans say, sicher oder musikalisch. That's reliable or musical. But I think in my teaching and in my belief is that if we hear it innerly, we work until we reach the way to bring it out the way we heard it. Could be wrong, could be misheard, could be therefore misunderstood. There's no objectivity in interpretation. You cannot always do literal translation for the very fact that the word interpretation means translation. And for poetic things, for even prose, one language to the other, yes, you have to translate the meaning, but if you try to translate the individual words, they don't fit the same way because the connotations are not the same for the same word in another language that was intended by the author. And so, same thing about music. We try to, I don't know how much I succeed to guess what the composer wanted. The notation doesn't say it all, perhaps for a good reason, is that music was, until the beginning of 20th century, read rather than practiced or rehearsed or performed. It was gathering to read for each other in a quartet, in trio, or solo to listen, or with a voice for a heart song. Or then people were around attending that reading session. Of course, one can say that in today's instrumental performance of classical musically trained musicians, specifically in my case pianists whom I teach, their technique in terms of independence of fingers, in terms of capacity of projecting and having a capacity of also sustaining the energy for a long time period, are things which are gymnastics, and they have to be in the muscular memory, the cognitive facts, but they shouldn't be in autopilot, separate from the conscientious effort to meaningfully say what the composer wrote, that you recite because the notes are there. The beginning and the end of the piece is there. You don't make it up unless you improvise, unless it's considered jazz today, but you can improvise in the style of the composer. So it doesn't have to be always jazz. But of course, because jazz is notated by charts, not by details in the notes, ways Bach's and before music of the continuo for the keyboard harmonists also. So it's the realization that mattered. The creativity is liked to be discovered and to be singled and to be appreciated between one jazzman and another playing on the piano variations on the same theme. And in classical music, because it's all notated, written, the way it's taught, generally, unfortunately, is to recite it precisely and take the least possible personal stand in the interpretation. And that comes from the fact that you have multiple juries for audition, competitions, positions, lifelong, and the people who hear you are also fed through the ur-text land. So it's beyond the authenticity of the claim of the ur-text, which can be always debated by different disagreeing between themselves music scholars. But it's an interesting topic because that is the theory part. But when you play, you play. And when you play on the piano, music written or not for it, you have to satisfy the tastes of the jury in order to succeed. So if you shock the tastes of them by doing something either deliberately eccentric, either convinced but still not in the norm, it becomes a problem, because international competitions are won by people who play convincingly for a vast group of people in the jury. So in a way, there has to be a lower denominator. And if somebody has a personality musically that sparks with some kind of creativity within the interpretation of the codified, especially for the famous pieces, published pieces, usually these people don't win competitions because they don't fit that very mold that is there to sort of organize a unification of the interpretational space beyond which it's not allowed. The tempo, the phrasing, the articulation, the ornamentation, the decoration, the rubato, the tempo, the pedaling, the left, the right foot, the middle pedal or not. And of course, memorization, precision, shifting, organization of the playing. And very often, at that level, it has to be practiced repetitively to the point to which it's numbing for the intellect. Because it has to go to, at some point, for the muscular memory, so it doesn't go that quickly. If it goes through the brain, or it goes directly through the brain for the reaction of the fingers, and the keyboard is heavier or uneven, then you're disturbed as a student by the keyboard. You say, oh, on this keyboard I cannot play it like I want. And so, of course, this is a problem, because we have to connect the what with the how. The what we want to produce, how to bring the voicing, which voicing, why, and why not, but also in the flow of events. It's not just a series of sections as obstacles course. And so I find that this active, contemplative state, it's probably the ultimate level of the music performing, where the performer, while active by essence, has to be also contemplative for the music they play, they present, they state, as the listeners who hear it, regardless if they know the piece or they don't, or if they know the different interpretations even of the piece, chances are, if they're music lovers. So they come to hear how you play this Schubert sonata, or you play this Chopin mazurka, because they like it by such and such. And that is marvelous, but you will never be able to fit in everybody's imaginary idealization of the piece's interpretation, because it doesn't mean the same to everybody. It means different things. And so, of course, if you can read a book without to need orator to disclaim it for you by declaiming it for you, then you read it by yourself. You understand or misunderstand, but it enters directly between your eyes, right away in your inner world. Just music through the ears, also the eyes when you read the music, but the ears, for what you heard, they produce the sounds, and then you think of them as something that you cherish and you carry in you. Then you reproduce it by bringing it out in turn. And I found that if everybody was taught in school to read music, just they're read like they're taught to read words and letters and chapters and books, they won't need the interpreter. So they could gather to hear a piece that they all love, but obviously differently. And they just spend the time of the piece looking at the music as if they're reading it again, like a book or a chapter of a book that you like, and you reread it because every time it brings you pleasure, or you discover more things, more layers. But it's an intimate, personal connection between the piece and you. You don't need somebody to read it to you. So you don't need somebody to play the piece for you to embody it. But probably the reason for which music is not taught as a grammar, or enough to be able to play in school bands with a very basic, if not minimalistic, music theory awareness, is not because I try to appear perhaps here very elitist and say, oh, that's very basic and it's not enough. No, it's marvelous because it allows to sing in choir, it allows to play in band, it allows to participate in music without to be a professionally trained musician, but enough to know the grammar. Of course, the complexity of reading a score like a GPS that has many parts, chamber music on piano or a piano reduction of an orchestra score, an opera or something, that demands, of course, more training. But ultimately, you can say that you don't need it because you can hear it anywhere you want, anywhere in the world. You click on it and you watch it or listen to it. But to produce it by yourself as a transcription or reduction or sight reading, it has something more intimately personal that becomes connection with you and the piece without the interpreter, without the virtuoso, without the, let's say, music scholars know-how. It just becomes something between you and the piece, which becomes an intimate connection, like with a book, a movie, a game, a video game or something. I don't put them on the same level, but nevertheless, there are situations where you are active, reactive, sometimes puzzled, sometimes lost in the storytelling. But in any case, you don't need an external person to present you the piece. And so if in improvisatory presentations, it's the creativity that is rewarded, the individuality that is praised. In classically trained pianists, it seems to be the exact opposite when they have to go through the funnel of exam juries competitions. They have to all sound alike. Politically correct playing. The problem is that it takes so much more than only going through the notes and the rhythms, because yes, factually you have to, because you respect, and you are taught discipline, and you're taught to play rightfully the thing. So you can say, oh, it doesn't matter to me if I played clean or not, as long as I played with my emotion or what it means to me. So as a teacher, I'm positioned as a hyphen between the composer, often dead, and the student, often very young by essence. And so what do I translate or transmit, or sort of, what am I hyphening? Is it through my experience, or is it my understanding of the piece? But they already love it, they hear it, they feel it, they understand it, perhaps misunderstand it in my taste. But I'm not here to lock them in my way of liking the piece. I'm here to unleash the way they play the better possible, the way they like it, or they think they do. Even if they will perhaps or not change mind by revisiting the piece later in their life, again, performing it, teaching it, writing it, or writing about it, or recording it, or whichever. But it will be their own path with the piece, through their own seasons of life. So I'm a hyphen between the composer, or of course I don't pretend to be the one to know what the composer intended beyond the notation. What I like to think is to demonstrate how he could have done a given modulation, or a given chordal progression, or a given melodic development differently by improvising it, believably, not mocking it, nor to make it, it's useless if you just make it like some kind of a spoof. It has to be meant. And then go back to the way it is, how the composer brought this transition, how the composer chose this modulation. And by presenting to the student variants that are not the ones, could have been with the knowledge of the style. And it's not again about pretending to play or recompose the piece, or because it appears immediately in the eyes of the people who recite the music as being obviously arrogant. No, in fact, what it is that you demonstrate that in order to say meaningfully what you should cherish in a piece, you have to be able to think of it differently, as if it were not the way it is. Now that of course takes time, because it takes also contextual understanding of the style, and not just of that piece, of all the pieces around it, included the other genres of the same composer if they were, so that you don't extract it out of nowhere, but it's part of the ecosystem of the composer's writing, in Tchaikovsky's ballets and Mozart's operas and Bach's fugues and mostly sacred music in both together, and Beethoven and Haydn's quartets. Not to reduce them just to that for each of them, but it is in a way their most earnest expression of their musicianship, of their intellect, of their soul, of the way they translate in sounds our experience of being humans. And then, of course, they write for piano, they write trios, they write, I don't know, quartets, ballets, musicals, operettas, incredibly different types of genres of music. But very often, even if the genre is specific and they adapt to its specificity, you can sense that they come from another genre, which is their main inner fountain of music creativity. And I find that to be very touching, personally. And when you play music of a composer who either we don't know the other works, many, or either they are not often heard or played, then we play a little bit more like an oddity, like a one-of-a-kind thing. You don't extract a Mozart sonata from his operas, symphonies, and masses, and quartets, and concerti. You extract it out of nowhere, if it's one piece of a lesser-known composer. And then becomes the problem, because you have to start thinking, how do I relate this composer to music in its chronology and styles, aesthetics? And you try to compare it to other composers, when for the famous ones who have a large compositional output, you rarely do so, because it is their own domain. Of course, in every time period, there are always composers who are lesser known, forgotten, for good or bad reason. it's not up to us to know. But the point is that the repertoire, especially for piano, is so vast that nobody could pretend to know it all. To know about it, it's already a lot. To know it, it's pretentious because it's plethoric. But to misunderstand because of a situation in which you're placed, to define it because of your own criterias based on the lack of knowledge of the rest of the output. And many composers influenced each other, generationally or even like musical siblings. And so what? They had a common alphabet. They did different things with it. And ultimately, the composers until the beginning of the 20th century had to survive by industrial productions of their craftsmanship. So they produced a lot of music. And what's very striking is that many of their pieces are very elaborate and different from each other. They didn't go for the easy simplicity to just, once they know how to make a quartet or symphony for Haydn, let's just make them all alike, or Vivaldi, or these prolific composers like Scarlatti. And I find that this is where we have to be very, very attentive with how much we perceive of the musical genius, personality, expression, evolving personalities through their lives, if they did in their stylistic aesthetics, of a composer's music. It doesn't come out of nowhere. It comes from, there is always a paternity in the music. Sometimes subconscious, sometimes willing. And then there is a breaking with the tradition. It's breaking with the inheritance and say, nah, it's not for me. I don't like that. And then in order to bring the individuality of the compositional signature, so to say, of the given composer, they have to break what they received. If not, they'll just reproduce it. But some don't need it. They just develop it, bringing it further with their own personality without to try to revolutionize the tonality or the phrasing or the organization of the thematic materials. In other words, it's very striking how some creators need to clean slate, and others just pick it from where they received it and bring it a bit further without pretending to reinvent it, to reinvent the very style. Is it because of necessity and not time? Possibly. But could be also that the motivation for a composer is perhaps melodic for the one, rhythmic for the other, harmonic. Of course, all of them are involved, but there are ones of them, of these, which prevail, which are the guiding light. And you hear it in Stravinsky or Bartók with the rhythm and the pulse, and you hear it in Debussy, for instance, with the harmonic colorizations, and you hear it with different composers who are driven by different aspects of the expression through the grammar of music. So do they always try to be different or personal, and do they not try to not sound like the other? I think that in the earlier days of the 18th, 17th century, it didn't matter so much. They just blend in the musical tradition of the place and the time. And of course, for the lucky ones who had the opportunity to travel and absorb different aesthetics, Italianate, English, Bohemian, German, Austrian, Hungarian, Gypsy, Armenian, I mean, folkloric or classically trained, it flavors differently their creativity. either because they represent it, as Albéniz, Spain, or Debussy, who writes in Spanish or Ravel style, being not Spanish fully, at least for Ravel, who was half. So it's not to do with it's to do with the intellect and the language and the culture and the way they spoke and they heard their languages, and then how they married the harmonic, stylistic affections between French and Russian music compared to German and Austrian. And it was, I think, with Wagnerism, the embodiment of this pan-Germanism, combining all the mythology and the art of the opera as a storytelling and the language. And the Italian opera was the most famous in Europe as a genre and the language. So yes, it is culture, and you can translate them, and you can sing Tchaikovsky opera in a different language, and you can sing Carmen in English, and you can, because that is done, or shouldn't be always done. But let's say that generally the reason for which I mention this is because I find that the composer's intellect is with their language of their mother tongue and the literature of it, and a certain sense of pride and perhaps a certain sense of reticence for other cultures, or the opposite. Because of that, they are open to even more extra-European cultures and becoming what today we would call, but they didn't always have the title, ethnomusicologists, going to places where only oral tradition of music prevailed, and they started writing it down in classical notation, reductive as it were, but at least documenting, even if recording would be better, but wasn't always readily available. So that, in fact, if the music is an international, universal language, it does have connections for each composer with their own realm of understanding the world. And I find that the temperament, the intellect, the faith, the way of thinking about finitude and about transmission and about soul and about translating in music the meaning of the experience of life. And that's why they colorize it with their own temperament, personalities, culture, and they don't have to be, and most of them were not that cultivated in the sense of knowledgeable in literature, some more than others, like Schumann compared to others, but Schubert also. So of course, they set words in music, and they fit the music so well to the words, just like rap for the English language or Italian language for the opera that came from Monteverdi onwards. And so it's true that it's universal. It is universal. But factually, when you get in depth to taste, understand, or develop a sensitivity towards a specific style, genre, be it a niche within it, you have to enter in the context of the intellect of the composer's surroundings, whether it be Berg with Vienna at the cusp of the war, or the French harpsichordists, or the early pianofortists in Germany. And then, of course, instrumental development brought in to write sonorous things, like Haydn writing sonatas on the Broadwood piano in London, which he couldn't have written on the Stein in Vienna, which were more spinets. And the harpsichord becoming a pianoforte didn't happen overnight, obviously. But in the transition, of course, the mindset also remains a little bit from the old days, and Beethoven develops complete works for piano, the sonatas that are representing the piano for which they are written, but through the genre of the quartet and the orchestra. with the ranges on the straight string pianos. And of course, you can say that some of them, like him, wrote through the piano the genres of the symphony and the quartets, which were his primary drive creatively. That's why this active awareness of the musical experience, this contemplative, which appears often to be passive, in fact, it's not. It's active because you absorb the atmosphere which comes through the piece. And then you reproduce that atmosphere and you search for how to. And I try to help the students for the how to.